The Korean War, which took place from 1950 to 1953, was a significant conflict that shaped the political landscape of the Korean Peninsula and had far-reaching implications for international relations during the Cold War era. This war was rooted in the division of Korea at the end of World War II, and the ideological struggle between communism and capitalism played out on the global stage. At the end of World War II, Korea, which had been under Japanese colonial rule since 1910, was liberated. However, the country was divided along the 38th parallel into two occupation zones. The Soviet Union controlled the north, and the United States controlled the south. This division was intended to be temporary, with the goal of eventually reuniting Korea. However, the onset of the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States led to the establishment of two separate governments, each claiming to be the legitimate government of all Korea. In the north, Kim Il-sung established a communist regime, while in the south, Syngman Rhee led a capitalist government. Tensions between North and South Korea were high throughout the late 1940s. Both governments wanted to reunify Korea under their respective ideologies, and skirmishes along the border were common. The North Korean government, supported by the Soviet Union and later China, sought to unify the peninsula under communist rule. Conversely, the South Korean government, backed by the United States and other Western allies, aimed to create a unified democratic Korea. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces launched a surprise invasion of South Korea. This marked the beginning of the Korean War. The North Korean People's Army, equipped with Soviet tanks and artillery, quickly advanced southward, capturing the South Korean capital of Seoul within 3 days. The South Korean military, the Republic of Korea Army, was ill-prepared and poorly equipped to withstand the assault. The rapid advance of the North Korean forces forced South Korean and United Nations forces into a desperate retreat. In response to the invasion, the United Nations Security Council convened and passed a resolution condemning the North Korean aggression and calling for member states to assist South Korea in repelling the invasion. The United States, under President Harry S. Truman, took the lead in organizing a UN military intervention. General Douglas MacArthur was appointed commander of the UN forces. By late August 1950, North Korean forces had pushed the UN and South Korean troops back to the Pusan perimeter, a small defensive line around the port city of Pusan in the southeastern corner of the Korean peninsula. The situation was dire, and it seemed that North Korea might achieve a swift victory. However, the UN forces, bolstered by reinforcements and supplies, managed to hold the line. The defense of the Pusan perimeter was a critical turning point in the war, preventing a complete collapse of South Korean resistance. In mid-September 1950, General MacArthur launched a daring amphibious assault at Incheon, a port city located near Seoul. The Incheon landing was a bold and risky maneuver, but it was highly successful. UN forces quickly captured Incheon and recaptured Seoul, cutting off the North Korean supply lines and forcing the North Korean forces to retreat. The success of the Incheon landing marked a significant shift in the momentum of the war, allowing UN and South Korean forces to go on the offensive. Following the Incheon landing, UN forces advanced northward, pushing the North Korean forces back across the 38th parallel. By October 1950, UN and South Korean troops had crossed into North Korea and captured the capital, Pyongyang. The rapid advance continued, with the goal of reunifying Korea under South Korean control. However, as UN forces approached the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and China, the Chinese government became increasingly alarmed. In late October 1950, Chinese forces, under the guise of the Chinese People's Volunteers, launched a massive counteroffensive. The entry of China into the war dramatically altered the balance of power. Chinese troops, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, launched surprise attacks on the advancing UN forces. The harsh winter conditions and the overwhelming numbers of Chinese troops forced the UN and South Korean forces into a rapid retreat. By early 1951, the front lines had stabilized near the 38th parallel, where the war had begun. The conflict entered a new phase characterized by brutal trench warfare and repeated offensives and counteroffensives by both sides. The fighting was intense, with significant casualties on both sides, but neither the UN forces nor the Chinese and North Korean troops were able to achieve a decisive breakthrough. As the war dragged on, the human and economic costs mounted. In the United States, public opinion began to turn against the war, and there were growing calls for a negotiated settlement. The new U.S. administration, under President Dwight D. Eisenhower, took office in January 1953 with a mandate to bring an end to the conflict. Peace negotiations had begun as early as July 1951, but progress was slow and often stalled over issues such as the repatriation of prisoners of war and the establishment of a demilitarized zone. Despite the ongoing negotiations, the fighting continued, with both sides attempting to gain tactical advantages to strengthen their positions at the negotiating table. Finally, on July 27, 1953, an armistice agreement was signed at Panmunjom. The agreement established the Korean Demilitarized Zone, a buffer zone along the 38th parallel, and effectively ended the fighting. However, it did not result in a formal peace treaty, and technically the two Koreas remain in a state of war to this day. The Korean War had profound and lasting impacts on the Korean Peninsula and the wider world. In Korea, the war resulted in immense devastation. Cities and infrastructure were destroyed, and millions of people were killed, wounded, or displaced. The war solidified the division of Korea into two separate states, each with its own political and economic systems. North Korea, under Kim Il-sung, pursued a policy of strict isolation and self-reliance, while South Korea, with significant U.S. economic and military support, embarked on a path of rapid industrialization and modernization. Internationally, the Korean War had significant implications for the Cold War. It marked the first major armed conflict between the forces of communism and capitalism, setting a precedent for future Cold War confrontations. The war also demonstrated the willingness of the United States and its allies to use military force to contain the spread of communism, a policy that would shape US foreign policy for decades to come. The Korean War also had a lasting impact on the United Nations. It was the first time that the UN had intervened militarily in a conflict, and the war highlighted both the potential and the limitations of the UN as a force for collective security. The war also had significant consequences for US-China relations. The entry of Chinese forces into the war led to a prolonged period of hostility and estrangement between the two countries, which would not begin to thaw until the 1970s. In terms of military strategy and technology, the Korean War was notable for several reasons. It saw the first widespread use of jet aircraft in combat, as well as the introduction of new technologies such as helicopters and improved tanks. The war also highlighted the importance of air superiority and the critical role of logistics in sustaining modern military operations. The legacy of the Korean War continues to be felt today. The DMZ remains one of the most heavily fortified borders in the world, and the Korean Peninsula remains a flashpoint for potential conflict. The ongoing tensions between North and South Korea, as well as North Korea's development of nuclear weapons, continue to pose significant challenges to regional and global security. In recent years, there have been various attempts to improve relations between North and South Korea, including summits between North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and South Korean President Moon Jae-in. While these efforts have led to some symbolic gestures of reconciliation, substantive progress toward peace and reunification remains elusive. The legacy of the Korean War continues to shape the geopolitics of East Asia and the broader international order. The Korean War also had profound social and cultural impacts on the countries involved. In the United States, the war influenced public attitudes toward military intervention and shaped the experiences of a generation of veterans. The Korean War is sometimes referred to as the Forgotten War in the United States, overshadowed by the more extensive and controversial Vietnam War. However, the sacrifices and contributions of Korean War veterans are remembered and honored through memorials and commemorations. In South Korea, the war is remembered as a pivotal moment in the nation's history. It is seen as a struggle for survival and independence, and the resilience and determination of the South Korean people during and after the war are sources of national pride. The war also played a significant role in shaping South Korea's national identity and its relationship with the United States. North Korea, on the other hand, views the war through the lens of its ideological narrative. The North Korean regime portrays the conflict as a heroic struggle against imperialist aggression, emphasizing the leadership of Kim Il-sung and the sacrifices of the North Korean people. The war remains a central element of North Korea's state propaganda and its efforts to legitimize the ruling regime. The Korean War also had important humanitarian implications. The conflict caused widespread suffering and displacement, with millions of Koreans becoming refugees. Families were separated by the division of the peninsula, and many remain divided to this day. Efforts to reunite separated families have been a poignant aspect of inter-Korean relations, highlighting the enduring human cost of the war. In the broader context of international relations, the Korean War underscored the complexities and dangers of the Cold War era. It demonstrated how regional conflicts could escalate into major international crises, involving multiple powers and posing significant risks of broader confrontation. The war also highlighted the challenges of post-war reconstruction and the difficulties of achieving lasting peace in the aftermath of a protracted and destructive conflict. The Korean War, while often overshadowed by other historical events, remains a critical chapter in the history of the 20th century. Its impacts are still felt today, influencing the geopolitics of Northeast Asia, the dynamics of US-China relations, and the ongoing tensions on the Korean Peninsula. Understanding the history and legacy of the Korean War is essential for comprehending the contemporary challenges and opportunities for peace and stability in the region. In conclusion, the Korean War was a complex and multifaceted conflict with profound and lasting consequences. It was a war that reshaped the Korean Peninsula, solidified the division between North and South Korea, and had significant implications for international relations during the Cold War. The war highlighted the ideological struggle between communism and capitalism and set the stage for future confrontations in the Cold War era. The Korean War also had lasting social, cultural, and humanitarian impacts, influencing the experiences and memories of those involved and shaping the national identities of both North and South Korea. As we reflect on the history of the Korean War, it is important to remember the sacrifices and resilience of those who lived through it, and to strive for a deeper understanding of its legacy in the pursuit of peace and reconciliation.